This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is the 6th episode of season 7, and today we are kicking off 2023 with an episode celebrating some of our favorite things that we've read and watched recently. So we are officially back from our holiday hiatus. We are all maybe well rested. Somehow these kind of vacations or holiday times off always seem to be maybe more exhausting than actual non-vacation times, but that's something we can talk about at a different date. We thought it would be kind of fun to do one of our recommendation episodes that we do semi-regularly with a new segment edition, and that is horror movie news. We spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about horror history, talking about the things that came before that have kind of like led the way to what we're enjoying now. And we don't often get to talk about a lot of the new things that are out there. So I thought this could kind of be a new fun addition to the podcast. So I'm just going to start us off with a bit of horror movie news. Then we're going to jump into our recommendations like normal. So the first bit of horror movie news that I am excited about, knowing Matt and Mel, I'm sure they're very excited about that as well. It is the new movie Renfield. And as we are recording this, the trailer, or I'm not sure if it was the full trailer, just the teaser trailer, dropped for Renfield. And I just know everybody is very, very excited. I think right now they're saying it's slated to come out in April. I'm not sure if that is a definite time. But this is a movie directed by Chris McCabe, written by Ryan Ridley, and here's the really exciting part. It stars Nicolas Cage as Dracula and Nicholas Hoult as his trusty servant Renfield. I could not be more excited for any kind of movie. Like, even just saying that aloud, I'm thinking, how did we get so lucky to get this? Number one, vampires, Dracula. I will watch almost any Dracula adaptation. But then to have Nicolas Cage, I know we've talked about Nicolas Cage on the podcast before. We very much enjoy his movies. And Nicholas Hoult, who he is absolutely one of my favorite new actors to watch. Oh, I guess he's not entirely new. He's been around for a few years, but I love watching him in The Great. I can't wait to see this. Just looking at some of the stills and the trailer for it, it really looks like they're leaning in not only to kind of the comedy of this, but the, dare I say, Hammer horror-esque ness, if that makes sense, of this. So I'm really excited to see it. I can't wait to see what they do with it. The other little, I guess, a few pieces of news that we're excited about that are coming up, of course, Paul Tremblay, who is a podcast favorite, his book, A Cabin at the End of the World, is being adapted into an M. Night Shyamalan movie. There's a great write-up on that in Fangoria, in the newest issue of Fangoria. So I highly recommend that you read that. I'm very excited. I've seen, again, the trailer, a few of the stills that have come out for that. Very, very much excited to see how that is adapted to the screen. And another podcast favorite, Grady Hendrix, has a new book that is releasing the same day as this podcast episode releases. So we get How to Sell a Haunted House, which of course will be wonderful. We can't wait for that. But we've also got two really good movies that are coming out, I think, in the first half of 2023. So if nothing else, I'm excited for that. So that's some of the kind of new horror movie news that we're excited about. Matt, Mel, I'm going to throw it over to you guys to get us started with recommendations. But I don't know how are you feeling about this new movie news, especially the Renfield? I'm very curious.
I'll jump in and answer that question. First of all, I know I said this before any recording started, but I love this idea of talking about upcoming movies and kind of having a horror movie news. I know a lot of people love horror movies, and even I mean, there's still great horror that's being produced today, as you've already mentioned. And to return to your question about Renfield, I was completely unaware of this movie until kind of right at the beginning of the year. So, roughly like 10 ish days ago, I was listening to the first episode of the year of the podcast Comedy Bang Bang, which I'm a fan of, and Ben Schwartz was on it. If you don't recognize his name or you're like, who is that guy? He's the guy that played John Ralphio on Parks and Rec. He also had a pretty big role on the Apple TV Plus show, The After Party. And apparently he's in Renfield. He must be a more minor role because I did not see him at all in the trailer, but he mentioned it and I was like, oh, well, that sounds really interesting. I like Ben Schwartz. And then not just a couple days later, I get a text from a friend of mine that's just a link to the trailer for Renfield with like an oh my God kind of comment. And so I watched the trailer and yeah, I'm super excited. I can't wait to see this movie. It definitely has the humor aspect to it, but even just from the trailer, there is some very delicious gore as well, like comedic gore, but still over the top gory. So I'm excited. I'm real excited to see that one. As far as I guess to go into my actual recommendations, I'm going to work a little bit backwards in terms of things that I've read lately. The first one that I'm starting off with is actually the most recent book I've read. I actually just finished it about a week, maybe a week and a half ago. And I'm a big fan of at the end of the year kind of Googling, you know, best of lists for specific genres. In my case, typically sci-fi and horror. And there was a book that was on a couple of the lists that really stood out to me. It's called Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes, because it kind of crosses over between both of those genres. It's set in the kind of near future, I guess 150 years from now. It is set in space, but it's also a kind of, I mean, it's also a horror book as well. It's about this crew that's out at the edge of colonized space in our solar system, where they kind of surface these comm links that they use to, you know, stay in contact with everybody. So they're right at the edge of where communication ends as far as how far we've colonized in the solar system. And they find a distress beacon for a ghost ship that had gone missing like 20 years before. And I mean, it's got moments that are reminiscent of Event Horizon. It's got the sci-fi aspect to it. There's some interesting backstory for the main character that you're kind of following her perspective throughout. It's it's really interesting, and it is like the scenes of them exploring this abandoned derelict ship that was essentially like kind of like the equivalent of the Titanic. It was meant to be this luxury cruise liner thing that was filled with a bunch of rich people mostly, and when they go in and are examining it, because it just went dark, it just disappeared, nobody knew really what happened. I mean, there's blood and bodies and this whole ominous feeling throughout it, and it's really fun. It's really good. So if you like kind of Titanic meets Event Horizon, I guess this is probably right up your alley. But I definitely recommend it. It's a pretty fun read, and I definitely want to check out more from S.A. Barnes after reading this.
Okay, I guess I will go ahead and jump in here. Matt, that sounds like a really interesting mix of sci-fi and horror. I might have to check that out at some point. And also, I want to say about the horror movie and book news that Lisa shared at the beginning. I'm really excited. Well, not only about the comedic aspects of Renfield, but also about Grady Hendrix's new book coming out. For some reason, I was thinking it was a little further along in the year. So I'm really excited to see his take on a kind of a contemporary haunted house. So the first thing I'm going to talk about that I enjoyed reading, and I guess we're thinking more like stuff that we read toward the end of 2022, since we did one of these type topics. Oh man, like August or September, I guess, of 2022. Um, I have been listening to the podcast that Tananarive do and her husband Stephen Barnes do, and I think they just had their 1 year anniversary episode of the podcast. And throughout the course of like the past summer and into the fall, they were talking a lot on their podcast about this graphic novel that they had worked on together called The Keeper, and the illustrator is Marco Finnegan. And they kept talking about when it was going to come out and how long they'd worked on this idea and where the idea came from. And it was just really fascinating to me. And so I actually put in a pre-order for it. I was pretty excited to see it come. And like right before I made that decision, they actually interviewed Marco Finnegan on their podcast. So I got to hear from the illustrator and the decisions that he made in the book. So I was just really fascinated by this. And sometimes I buy books and I let them sit and I don't look at them for a while because I'm kind of like a book collector. But I decided I was going to go ahead and sit down and read this while the interview was still fresh in my mind and the things that they had been talking about were fresh in my mind. And I really enjoyed it. It's a fascinating graphic novel. It kind of like it's a creature feature, I guess you would say, and I don't think that's a spoiler because you just look at the cover of it. I think you see that coming, and it basically follows this young girl, this young African American girl who kind of finds herself like an orphan. And her parents are killed in a car crash, and she has to move in with her grandmother. And her grandmother is extremely ill, and there's the worry of what's going to happen to her if her grandmother passes away. And her grandmother has this kind of thing that happened in her past. Her family has this dark past, that they have this connection to this creature. And I don't want to talk too much more about it because I don't want to spoil anything. But basically, what I think they do that's so fascinating is not only having almost like a haunted house, haunted family type thing slash creature feature, but the idea of the different interpretations of what the creature could be or whether the creature is beneficial or dangerous. So I thought it was a really interesting haunted, like supernatural piece, but also a really interesting kind of coming of age story. And it ended up being named the best graphic novel of the year by the Washington Post and Book We Love by NPR. So that was really cool too. So yeah, I would recommend checking out Tananarive Due and Stephen Barnes, The Keeper, especially if you're interested in kind of coming of age horror, um, or kind of creature feature horror in a graphic novel format.
One of the things I love about doing these kind of recommendation podcasts is I feel like all of us talk about really interesting things and very like different aspects of the horror genre, which is so much fun because I'm taking as many notes as I have in front of me for things that I want to add to my list, which is probably a good thing. But the movie I want to mention is one that I watched pretty recently. It's called The Menu. And I don't want to say too much about this movie, except that I just think everybody should watch it. It's not quite horror like it is horror. I would definitely put it in the horror genre, but it's also comedy, although like very dark comedy, and it's got some kind of thriller suspense aspects to it too. So it's one of those movies that really crosses genres in a really fun way, but it does it well. It's about this. Well, you start off following this couple, Nicholas Holt again, which I wasn't even thinking when I started putting this together that I was mentioning him in this, and then and also in the Renfield movie. But he is out with his girlfriend, who is played by Anya Taylor-Joy, and they are going to this very exclusive restaurant that is run by a world-renowned, famous kind of celebrity chef played by Ray Fiennes. And the gist of this is that they're paying an exorbitant amount to eat this tasting menu. And they're going to a private island where the only thing on the island is this restaurant, and they only sit like 12 people. It's very exclusive. It's kind of playing off that culture of like foodie, ultra inventive type of meals, that kind of thing. And it just goes insane. It goes to some truly insane places. This movie does. And I don't want to say anything to spoil it. If you've seen the trailer, you get kind of a gist for what the movie is. But it was just such a joy to watch. Like it was so much fun. And it was originally in theaters. It may still be in some theaters right now. And then I think you can watch it on, at least in America, you can watch it on HBO Max. I'm not sure about other places, but I just can't say enough. Like, this is one of those movies that as soon as I finished it, I started texting people and saying, you have to watch this movie. But then I wanted to get more of this type of thing. So I immediately went out and bought the book, A Certain Hunger by Chelsea G. Summers, which is also about this like food critic person. So it's kind of like a satire of that, again, that like foodie culture that's out there. And yeah, I think that's the mark of a good like book or movie, is that it immediately makes you want to go out and like explore the world more. So the menu, I guess, with like a little parenthetical, that it inspired me to buy A Certain Hunger. So
I have been wanting to watch The Menu for a little while now. I added it to my HBO Max watch list, and I just haven't had a chance to sit down. So I may have to make some time this weekend to watch that. I've been wanting to, and I think you just pushed me over the edge there. So, yay. Um, so my next recommendation is how ironic that, I mean, you said that you weren't planning to mention Nicholas Hoult twice, and I was certainly not planning this. You mentioned Paul Tremblay's Cabin at the End of the World that's being adapted into the M. Night Shyamalan movie. Well, my next recommendation is actually his latest book, The Pallbearers Club, which I think it came out towards the middle to end of last year. And one thing that I really like about Paul Tremblay is that a lot of his stuff riffs on certain genre tropes of horror. Like A Head Full of Ghosts is kind of a ghost story, while also, well, I guess, more a possession story. Um, and then Survivor Song is kind of his take on a zombie movie. And this one is his spin on kind of the vampire story, while also apparently including a lot of stuff that's kind of autobiographical in terms of apparently the main character is uh, very richly based on him as a younger person, because it mostly takes place in high school and then into the character's 20s and 30s. And it's almost, there's a moment where he even says, because I know Paul Tremblay is also daylights as a teacher, and there's a moment when the character's in college where he says that if such and such hadn't happened, then he probably would have ended up being a teacher. And it's just a very funny little nod. But the whole story is kind of based around the main character's relationship with a girl named Mercy, who the novel spends quite a while kind of flirting around the idea of whether or not she's a vampire, and not like a literal like Dracula drink your blood vampire, but sort of a psychic vampire. That's kind of what the main character begins to suspect she may be, and I won't reveal whether or not she is because it's ambiguous up until the end, and it's very well played with the ambiguity. He really does um, a good job of not giving you all the answers until he does. But basically, I mean, he feels like she is, in a sense, sucking the life out of him. They have a falling out, and then kind of reconnect like 10 years later. One thing about it that was just really cool, though, is the main character is kind of a social outcast and doesn't have a lot of friends, and gets really, really into punk music. And that's kind of where he begins to find himself and find his identity, and is talking about all of these previous like old 80s punk bands and that sort of thing. And reading that book, it made me want to go back and start listening to all of these old bands. So I actually did. I made a playlist and was listening to like Husker Du and the Ramones and lots of other punk bands while reading it. But there's definitely a lot that I could see of myself in that same character. So I think that may be why I really enjoyed it as well. But I won't give any spoilers to it, but it's definitely worth the read. One other thing to mention about it too is that if you do get the ebook version, make sure you get the latest version. I think they it should all be sorted out at this point. But when it first released from Amazon for the Kindle, there were some formatting issues, because one thing about it is that it's formatted as a manuscript that the character wrote that's actually annotated by his friend Mercy. So she's responding to things that he says, and the formatting was very weird. They had to pull it from the Kindle store and re-release it like a couple days later. But that should all be sorted out now. But it's a really interesting trope that that Paul did in not just tackling the vampire, but having one character responding to someone else's memoir, if you will.
I haven't gotten the Pallbearers Club yet. I have the book, haven't gotten to it, but from your description, I probably need to move it up on my list because I love Tremblay's use of ambiguity in his stories and novels, and it sounds like this one is pretty similar. So my next one, I don't know if it's a recommendation because I'm sure listeners already like this writer, but it's more of an update. So one of our last Masters of Horror was Stephen King, and I had talked about how I needed to read more of King. And listeners, I did it. I I am in the midst of reading more. It kind of became a little project for me in the last few months, and so I had never read all of On Writing. I'd only read part of it. So I burned my way through that. And I read Dolores Claiborne, as I think I mentioned I would. And I read Firestarter. And I have to say, like, I enjoyed, I listened to audiobooks of two of the three. And I enjoyed all three of them. But I think I particularly had fun with Firestarter, and I don't really think that it requires a plot summary because most people have probably already read it, especially with the two movies. But it was kind of like in my wheelhouse or up my alley or whatever idiom you want to use, because I am very interested in like more sci-fi type stuff sometimes with my horror. And I was also kind of a fan of the original 4400 when it came out, and I like thrillers and things like that. So the idea of like a weird government conspiracy about people with psi powers that kind of breaks down into horribleness for the people that were experimented on is like something that I figured I would be very into, and it didn't take me long to get through the book, and I very much enjoyed it. Now I feel like I gotta like watch the movie adaptations, though. When I like a book this much, sometimes I don't want to see how someone adapted it because I'm afraid I might be too close to it. So I might give myself a little bit of time before I look at those, give myself a little space from the book before I investigate how it was adapted.
On Writing is one of those books that I go back to and read several times because there's just so much good in there. There's so much
It's
Uh,
so
It,
useful. It
it
really
is.
is. And it really motivates you to want to write, like no matter what you're writing, no matter what you're working on.
Exactly. And he's such a great storyteller anyway that it's an enjoyable read because it is useful and it does give good information, but he's also just telling such good stories and talking about his own writing process and like the horror genre in general. That's a really great one. So, yeah, I'm glad you're diving into that. Well, my next recommendation is another movie, and this one I feel like I should be embarrassed to to share just the depth of my love for this movie that I watched. I think it's a new classic favorite of mine. That is Violent Night, which came out this the end of 2022. It's of course the Santa horror movie with David Harbour as Santa in this. And basically, the plot of this movie is that Santa is out on his Christmas Eve shindig, delivering presents to all the kids around the world. And he's delivering to this one house that happens to be a very wealthy family. And at the time that Santa is there, a group breaks into the house to steal some things that are in the house and holds the family, and Santa has to kind of step in and save the day. And this movie, it was again, it was exactly what I wanted it to be. I love David Harbour. I don't know, I really enjoy watching him play Hopper on Stranger Things, and he did not disappoint. He was the perfect Santa in this movie. And it has John Leguizamo, who's another favorite of mine, who is kind of the leader of the bad guys in this movie. And the best way I can describe it is it's as if you took the movie Home Alone, which is one of my favorite Christmas movies, and you remade it for adults, but very like tongue in cheek. And I don't know, this movie just, it doesn't promise anything. Like, it doesn't promise anything. It knows what it is, and it does it well. That's what I'll say about this movie. um I did say I feel a little bit guilty in how much I love this movie because the reviews of it were not great, and a lot of people were kind of, a lot of the reviews I read were like, what kind of person like goes and sees this movie and enjoys it? And I thought, me, that too. I enjoyed this type of movie. It was fun, and it's going to be something that I think I watch a lot around the holidays. So yeah, I'm gonna say Violent Night, and I hope people don't judge me for that. But it's again, it's not it's more in the kind of action comedy realm of movie, but it has a lot of gore and a lot of really fun gore too. So I think for that horror fans may really enjoy it. I think anybody who enjoys something like Gremlins, but maybe just wants a little bit more like guts and blood spilled, would probably enjoy this. So that's my other kind of movie recommendation for this go around is Violent Night.
Well, I will judge you for that. Um, not really, not really,
I was about
but
to say, Matt, I think it would be up your alley if you haven't seen
it actually does sound pretty up my alley, to be honest. So uh, I may have to check that one out. So my last recommendation is an interesting one, and I guess I saved the most interesting for last. I don't know if I'll say saved the best for last because I like all three of these recommendations that I'm giving, but this one is definitely it definitely wins points for most innovative concept, that's for sure. It's a novel called This Thing Between Us by Gus Moreno, and it takes as its central premise a question of, I guess, a modern question of what would happen if your smart speaker was haunted or possibly possessed. And it's a really interesting book. I mean, it's obvious that he's kind of winking and nodding towards the Amazon smart speaker ecosystem of Alexa, but he never, I guess for copyright reasons, never refers to it as that. He comes up with his own brand name for the smart speaker that this young couple purchases. But it's a really interesting book, and that's really only half the story, though, because about halfway through, the story turns, and there's kind of a major plot point that basically sees the main character working through grief, all while also dealing with this shadowy thing that's been invoked by his smart speaker. It's really hard to describe and put into words, but it's a really cool idea that when I first read about it, I thought, okay, this sounds interesting, but I don't know if it's a good enough idea that could sustain an entire novel. Like, it would have to be done well. And he Gus Moreno delivers. He really does. It's a really good book. Like I said, the second half is this interesting meditation on grief and the grieving process, and it's wildly different from the first part, which is super creepy because they have this smart speaker that will activate in the middle of the night when they're all asleep. It begins ordering things for them that nobody ordered, things like that, things that could be easily attributed to glitches, but they get more and more sinister as time progresses. And yeah, it's very, very interesting and very, very well done. I was really impressed by the book by the end of it. So I would definitely recommend this one, especially how well he handles the topic. I guess it's really well done. So This Thing Between Us by Gus Moreno, definitely worth checking out.
Yeah, I know I said this before we started recording, Matt, but I actually just purchased This Thing Between Us by Gus Moreno because I'd heard about it on a podcast. And so, I mean, I was going to read it anyway, but now that you were talking about it, I'm even more excited to read it, even though I understand it's going to be weird. All right, so this is my final book that I read recently and really enjoyed, and it is Rachel Harrison's Such Sharp Teeth, which came out, I believe, in October, yes, of 2022. So yeah, two of my three blurbs I'm giving here are very, very recent books. And Such Sharp Teeth was actually, I think, my first Rachel Harrison book, though I read Cackle, her story, her witch story, I guess you would say, relatively close to it. Such Sharp Teeth is as a werewolf novel, as it was marketed, and it is. I read it in 2 days, I think. I think I read Cackle in 1 day. I have read two of Harrison's books now, and both of them I burned through. They're just propulsive to me. I'm really interested in the protagonist and what's going to happen to them. And I don't quite know how she does it, but yeah, I mean, I just kind of burn through them kind of plot wise. But Such Sharp Teeth is really fascinating because it's a werewolf story, and the protagonist is a young woman who is moving back to her hometown. And she's not happy about it. She's used to being in a very urban place. She has a very successful career that she's proud of, but her sister is pregnant and needs support, and has asked her to come help her. And so she is doing that. But going back to their hometown causes all the problems that anyone going back to their hometown could have, which is kind of the mundane domestic part of the book, I guess, underneath the werewolf story. Her best friend from school who had a crush on her is still there, and they're trying to negotiate that. So there's a bit of a romance in the book as well. There's a little bit of comic touches, but it is dark. It is a werewolf story. There's biting and violence and body transformations, body horror, all of that. And it's kind of fascinating to me how Harrison deals with women's relationships, here siblings, but also the idea of like body transformation and how that works just in our regular lives, but could also be represented with the metaphor of a werewolf, and just also the idea, of dealing with things that you didn't ask for, but you have to deal with, and transforming, I guess, not just into something else, but also into a new way of being. I guess that may sound very vague, but this is also kind of a coming of age story, even though the main character we're with is like in their late 20s. This was my second Rachel Harrison book. Listeners who also listen to Monster She Wrote podcast may know that Lisa and I talked to Rachel Harrison and interviewed her when Such Sharp Teeth came out. So if you're interested in that, you can check that out. But I now want to read her book, The Return, which Lisa recommended to me a while ago, and I put a hold on at the library, and then the ebook license for the library expired before I even got close to being on the hold list to get it, and now it's back, so I'm going to get back on the hold list. So hopefully at some point I'll be reading The Return, even though I know it's very tonally different from Such Sharp Teeth and Cackle, which are kind of similar. But I'm curious. I want to see what the third book is all about. So that is Rachel Harrison's Such Sharp Teeth for folks who like werewolf books.
I'm really glad you mentioned Rachel Harrison, and I cannot wait for you to read The Return, because I think it's going to be something that you really enjoy. So I'm really looking forward to when you finally get a chance to read that one. Well, my last recommendation is not a movie, and it is not a book. It is a podcast. It is the new podcast, well, new-ish, I should say, from Gimlet Media. It's a Spotify original and is produced by Monkey Paw, which is Jordan Peele's production company. And this, I think, is a fun podcast for a couple of reasons. One is that it was written, at least in part, by Clay McLeod Chapman, who is a horror writer. You may have read some of his books, like The Ghost Eaters. Has got that one in particular, I think, has gotten a lot of, I don't know if you want to, buzz. I guess that's the right word. There are a lot of buzz around it. A lot of people have really enjoyed it. And Clay really knows what he's doing when it comes to, I think, spinning a horror narrative. So seeing what he does in the podcast space is kind of exciting. This is one of those podcasts that really, I think, plays around with sound in a really interesting way, in a really kind of scary way. And I think I saw an interview with Jordan Peele where he said he wanted to make, kind of quote, the scariest podcast that's ever been made. And so I don't know if this one would qualify as like the scariest, but it's kind of fun knowing that that's what they went for. So the basic gist, I guess, behind this one is that it's about this radio host who, well, he's described as a disgraced radio host. He's kind of fallen from favor, and he's looking for a chance to reignite his career. And so he does that by looking at true crime. And so he looks at this cold case that involves the disappearance of several Muslim teens from Staten Island. And he kind of discovers that there's more behind their disappearance than really he's given much credit to or much thought to. And it's really interesting. The podcast tagline is "Lies Bake Monsters," so I think that's kind of fun. And I heard that at least one of their episodes, for just a short while it was on Spotify, um, temporarily at least knocked Joe Rogan from the top spot on Spotify, which I think as far as like podcasts go, that's like that's the bar that's been set. But yeah, I would highly recommend it if you're a fan of horror, if you're a fan of like podcast and audiobooks. This might be something fun. The episodes are out now. It is only on Spotify. I think it's a Spotify exclusive. So I think it's just something fun if you're really kind of into that. And there is kind of like a political theme underneath it, which I think maybe makes it timely, we'll say. But that's Quiet Part Loud, out from Gimlet Media and Monkey Paw Productions. All right, well, guys, I think that's gonna wrap it up. We had some really good recommendations for this particular one. We've been reading some reading and watching some really exciting things in 2022. I know there's a lot to look forward to in 2023 on the horror front, and so that's always, I don't know, that's always something to get excited about. Well, if there's something that's on your radar that maybe you'd like to talk about with us, please reach out to us on social media. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page, so you can post something over there and one of us will see it. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. Remember, it's KNOW. If you love what we're doing, you can support us on Patreon. Now, right now, we have paused the Patreon mini feed, but there is an entire backlog that goes back many seasons of free episodes that you can download if you become a Patreon supporter. Or if that's not in the cards for you, which we completely understand because not everybody has money that they can just give away, you can do something to help us that will be entirely free for you, and that is leaving us a rating and a review on whatever podcast listening app you use. This helps us not only with the algorithm kind of push us further up there, but it also helps other listeners find us. So we would greatly appreciate just dropping an easy rating and review. All right. Theme music is by Nicholas Gasparini, and we will be back in 2 weeks with a new episode.